when you think of the Netherlands, you've been to the Netherlands.
Have we started?
Excuse me?
Have we started?
Yes.
I'm on.
Yeah.
Oh, I saw this was warming up.
So I asked ChatGPT, do you know Professor Peter Mayo? And it said, as an IA language model, I don't have personal knowledge or direct interaction with individuals unless they are publicly recognized figures or have significant contributions in their fields of work. However, if you provide more context about who Peter Mayo is and his background, I can try to provide you with more information about him, such as his profession or any notable achievements. So I said, because it's an interaction, that's the funny thing about this language, it interacts with you. So I said, Professor Peter Mayo, he's a professor from Malta, and then it said, yes, Peter Mayo is a Maltese academic and scholar. He's a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Malta, where he has taught for many years.
That's from Wikipedia.
His research focuses on critical theory, adult education, and popular culture, and he has published numerous articles and books on these topics. Mayo is also known for his involvement in social movements and his advocacy for social justice and human rights.
That's flattering.
He has been active in a number of grassroots organizations and
that's not true.
Social movements.
That's an overclaim. That's an overclaim.
Social movements and his advocacy in Malta and internationally. He has worked to promote critical education and popular education as a tool for social change. Last paragraph.
That's good.
In addition to his academic work, Mayo has also been involved in public service and has served in a number of government advisory roles and commissions in Malta. He is widely recognized as a leading intellectual and public figure in Malta and has received numerous awards and honors for his work.
What do I think of Holland? When I was young, and that was some time ago, I'm 67 now, for the benefit who's listening to me. Holland met windmills, women with a, that kind of hat.
Satellite.
Yeah, because my family, my aunt passed away, all of them. They did go to Holland, of course. Eventually, music, there was a guy. I was a small kid, and I used to watch Italian television, and he was a guitarist. Peter Van Wood was his name. I don't know if it was Peter Van Wood. Not my kind of music. But then, round about the late 60s and 70s, popular culture was very strong, Dutch popular culture. So Holland meant hippies, Amsterdam.
Yeah, sure.
It meant Johan Cruyff.
Yeah.
Total football. That's the first thing which comes to mind.
Yeah.
Okay, Johan Cruyff, Marco van Basten, you name it. And my favorite player passed away. Jacintus Maria Murin. His brother played for my favorite football team, Manchester United, Arnold's. But he was a player I liked a lot. He was known as Jerry Murin. Passed away. Good midfield player. And then, so Dutch football, of course, Dutch painting, 17th century. I mean, 17th century was a great century for Dutch.
Sure, yeah.
After you broke away from what is Belgium today.
Yeah.
Rembrandt, of course. Rembrandt is Rembrandt. We used to put him on the same pedestal as and I think rightly so, with Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. Vermeer.
Vermeer, yeah, Johannes Vermeer.
He's one of my favorite painters, Vermeer. Peter de Hooch. Excuse my pronunciation.
Oh, fine.
Many, you know, like Frans Hals, Van Gogh. How do you say
Van Gogh, yeah. Van Gogh.
Van Gogh. And anyway, I'm sure there are others, but football, that, and music.
Yeah.
And of course, it was my request that as a soundtrack for this soundtrack, you use one of the bands which blew me away. And that was the early 70s. It was the age of Johan Cruyff and Van Hanegem, because it was Feyenoord before.
Yeah.
They won the European Cups. And then the Dutch 74, which I had predicted in an article I wrote as a 16-year-old. The Dutch might win, because you have so many good players. You put them together, you have a national team. 1974, guess what happened? And I wrote this in 1971. There was Feyenoord and Ajax had just won its European Cup. But anyway, let me not get lost on this stuff. Music. This was the age of, there were Dutch who were making inroads into the hit parade in England. You have the one season wonder, the one song wonders like Venus, what's it called, that one? Shocking Blue.
Yeah.
I remember that. And T-Set. But the group, because I was into rock a lot. I don't look like it, but I was. And progressive rock, for that matter. I still follow that. The band which blew me away is Focus.
Focus.
Yeah, Hocus Pocus is one of its numbers. Sylvia is the one we are using in the yeah. I love that. I love that.
Why? Tell me why.
Well, it was the age of progressive rock, 70s. I still listen to some Italian bands who are great progressive rock performers. Like, for example, Premiata Formeria Marconi. They were very well known outside Italy. I have people in Canada, not Italians in Canada, who would mention them to me, PFM. Now, when I first heard Focus, there used to be a program on Italian radio, and they used to have, what's it called? Something, the Palace of the King, something like that. And that was the soundtrack. That was the whole thing. And I thought, because it was flute, Astis van Leer, and John Ackerman is the other great, the accent, right? Yeah, John Ackerman, great guitarist. Well, you know, one of the greatest, I think, of all times. Together with Clapton and all these people, and Jimmy Page, or whatever, and the guy who just died, Jeff Beck. Well, I thought, I had never heard Focus, and I thought in the House of the King, it was called. It's a very popular one. It's all instrumental. I thought that was Jethro Tull. And then I discovered a Dutch band called Focus. Wow. Then I had a friend of mine who lent me his cassettes. And of course, they blew me away, Focus. And I still like them. So for me, they represent something about Holland. But of course, there's so many things about Holland. Well, I do think the stereotype I have of a Dutch person, of the Dutch people, they are makers of great culture and progressive culture. I see Dutch as progressive people. Now, I could be fooled. I never lived in Holland. I visited, but I've never lived in Holland. I have friends who married Dutch and live in Holland. I have a friend, for example, she's qualified. She has a doctorate in counseling psychology. Her husband is Ajax from Amsterdam, etc. My son was not into football a lot, but his family was Ajax. But yeah, and Ajax, again, I don't want to fall into that. So yeah, I mean, there was a certain, I tend to romanticize the Dutch.
So you consider the Dutch to be a progressive people? But
that's because I've been exposed to icons who were progressive.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean the average person is going to be like that. The icon is very progressive. Johan Cruyff was very progressive. He changed the nature of the whole currency of football. Music, Focus, they're not 100% original, because you've had Emerson, Lake and Palmer and all these. Not 100%, but they were part of a very progressive drive. And in paintings, the revolutions that painters did in 17th century, for example, and even later, but 17th century. So But of course, I know this is the tip of the iceberg. This is not your average Dutch person. About that, I cannot comment because I don't.
So let's turn it around. What's a typical stereotype Maltese person? How are you regarded by the rest of the world?
I qualified my statement earlier on by saying I have built ideas on icons. Average Dutch person.
Of course.
So I'm reluctant to say that about Maltese. Look, we are a mixture of so many things, as most people are all over the world. We're hybrid. Our language derives from Arabic and other Semitic languages. So I speak a Semitic tongue, Maltese, but it's written in a Romance script. Now, I wouldn't want to go there because people are so different, but traditionally now society has been changing because of multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity. Malta has become very multicultural. This wasn't the case when I was growing up. And this certainly wasn't the case before I went to Canada for the first time in 1986. That Canada I found, which was not the most well-known place, Edmonton, Alberta, was the place, beautiful place. It was the best year and a half of my life. And the friends I made there were tremendous. But it's not like, you know, people know about Toronto. I was stupid in this sense. We had it in geography, but I have forgot. I didn't even know Alberta was the province, not the city. The city is called Edmonton. So I was that ignorant about Canada. Most of the rock singers I used to follow and love, but I never used to buy the melody maker and read about them, were Canadian. And I thought they were American. Like Joni Mitchell, like Neil Young, although Neil Young, you should get that because he's got a song about Lake Ontario, for example. Gordon Lightfoot, you name them. The Guess Who, I got to know these when I went to Canada. They are Canadian. So if I say Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. So, I mean, basically, that was such a multicultural place. And I lived in a multicultural student residence with my 2 children, etc. That wasn't Malta. It was a new, I had been to England, to London several times, you know, so it's not, I had been to Italy and London before that, and Belgrade and other places. But so for the first time, then I come to Malta many years later. The same environment comes to Malta. So Malta right now, if I had gone to Edmonton or even Toronto, touted as the great multicultural city par excellence, I would not have had a change in my life because I mean, Malta's like that. I mean, Malta is African, European, you name it. I mean, you go anywhere in Malta and you're going to meet Spaniards, you're going to meet Portuguese, you're going to meet Greek, you're going to meet Turkish, you're going to meet Turkish kebabs everywhere, you know, like Syrians, you know, everything.
All right, well, let me rephrase the question. Why would anyone visit Malta as opposed to, let's say, Turkey or Greece? What's so special about Malta?
Well, it had natural beauty. I said it had.
It had.
Why? Because we have a big problem in Malta. The construction lobby is very powerful. They are very powerful. They exploit a lot of African workers, of course. No safety and things like that. And they have great control over the political system. And they're turning Malta to what I call they're making Malta go through a process of what my colleague Carmel Borge once wrote and called uglification. Malta has become one large, it has its beauty spots still, and I hope a bit of it will remain for posterity, okay? Because the environment is, as First Nations people teach us, they are borrowed from future generations, but they have turned Malta into one large construction site. The place is small. And before there used to be a distinction between town and country, between village and village. And some of our traditions are related to that. They use fireworks and things. And the fireworks were there to show the other village they've got a feast. Today, you could be moving from one village, enter a different area, and you say this is a different locality. It's all built up. Very few spaces are vanishing. And we have to do something about it because the impact, the environmental impact is going to be stronger in a small country, small landmass.
Of course. So what do you do to keep your own identity? Because if you uglify it that much, what's left?
They get away. Construction people are so powerful. They get away with murder. I mean, because they fund the parties. Party funding is a big issue. They fund the parties, and they fund both sides. So they're always winners. The other great powerful people in Malta are the importers. Because, Malta imports most of the things it needs. So importers' lobby is a very strong one. Traditionally, it would have been the clerical professional classes, but that's changed. One person, by the way, who has done interesting anthropological work, of course, as always, when you have a foreign anthropologist, there's a colonial element about it. People probably won't like it. Now we have our own local anthropologists, and we should study them, not they study us. Are Dutch. We have two Dutch people. One of them, Canadian Dutch. I knew him. I even as a family. He passed away. The other one is I won't mention the name. He wrote about prelates and the church in Malta, and he's Dutch. He's
so you even relate
fair art supporter. I think from Rotterdam he is.
So you even relate Dutch researchers to colonialism, although England was the one who colonized Malta, not the Netherlands.
No, I know, but there are different ways of colonizing. I keep telling my anthropology friends, who were actually amongst the most interesting academics in our university. I used to work very close because they were very progressive. But I used to pull their leg by saying, like in Africa, many places in Africa, anthropology is banned. Do you know that?
No.
Tanzania, they introduced everything. Sociology after independence under Julius Nyerere, except anthropology, because it was perceived as being white males coming to Africa to study us.
It makes sense, yes.
And of course, I have to mention this, yes. Anthropology in its origin in the 70s in Malta has a Dutch thing to it, because the first two anthropologists who had great influence and published books about Malta, and they're very popular in Malta, were Dutch. So that I would add that to what Holland means also. Maltese anthropology. But now we are producing our own anthropologists. Of course, I hope they also study the white people coming from the northern countries, not just subaltern groups, right? Or India, things like that. Don't imitate what your professors do at Cambridge University, because most of them are graduates of Cambridge University. Anyway, we've had some really good ones. And I miss a great friend. I had a very great friend. He was half American and half British, Paul Clow. And he was into anthropology. He's Oxford trained, but he was very open. But he did also research amongst Africans in Nigeria. But he wrote interesting stuff and is very sensitive, very much into Marx. He knew Marx's stuff very well. And I miss them because they were very interesting. The young generation of anthropologists in Malta are better than other people teaching humanities, in my view. I really used to work more, even about migration, with them than with others. Yeah.
What I would like to do now is move to a different field, namely the field of critical pedagogy. And you're going
to ask me a quote. You're going to ask me a definition, and I've got one here for you.
Well, before I do so, I asked ChatGPT a definition as well, the chatbot. So I'm just curious what you think of it.
Well, so, it's the major concern in our faculty and in our university. I mean, it's quite widespread. It's quite widespread.
I asked ChatGPT the definition of critical pedagogy. So I said, what is critical pedagogy? And it said, critical pedagogy is a teaching and learning approach that emphasizes the importance of questioning power structures and social injustices in education and society at large.
That's a brilliant definition, I thought.
It aims to empower learners to think critically about the world around them and to take action to challenge inequality and oppression. Critical pedagogy views education as a tool for social change and recognizes the role of education in perpetuating or challenging dominant narratives, power structures, and cultural norms. The approach emphasizes the importance of dialogue, reflection, and action, and seeks to create learning environments that are inclusive, democratic, and participatory. Critical pedagogy is often associated with the work of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who emphasized the need for education to be a liberatory experience that empowers learners to challenge the status quo and work towards social transformation.
Yeah. I think Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, and many of that gang, including me, would subscribe to that. We would sign that. However, what you are bringing out here is the danger of that instrument. You know, in education, we also question testing. Henry Giroux, I remember, speaks about this. Even he writes everywhere about it, but even in your interview. And we say there are alternative ways of evaluating students. It doesn't have to be an exam, right? In fact, exams for me are a joke, because an exam, I used to lose a good 30% of what I know, because you're writing against the clock, etc., and it's artificial. And you can bluff. The problem is, it's going to be very difficult to argue against exams now with this kind of instrument coming in. Because in an exam, you can't take it with you the instrument from which you've read.
No.
But if you're going to work on assignments for continuing assessment, you can jolly well use that. And that's where it's dangerous. So it is another instrument which militates against that pernicious, some people call it important though, necessary evil, I don't agree, which is the examination. What I think, and that's dangerous. It doesn't have to be a written exam. Italians, for example, were well known, are very famous because they have oral exams. And I feel I would have been a much better, more successful student if I had that. You know, because I've got the gift of the gab, I think.
Yeah.
You know, like that's good. But even now, Italians have gone the other way, writing. You know that exams are so problematic. I remember I was taught to be when I was a teacher, it's a necessary evil. We used to read about it, and even some luminaries have written about it. I forgot who, but we had these luminaries, you know, these kind of instruments, I think, will turn education. Well, as Chomsky told you, but I followed Chomsky. He's right. It's a sophisticated way of plagiarism. That's what it is. That's what it is. And so people are going to emphasize exams more and more, unless it's the kind of education where you do practical projects. But even there's no guarantees. There aren't instruments and mechanisms to do them for you, you know. But that's the worrying thing about it. Now, this is mostly amongst undergrads where you have huge numbers. I think if you're a serious teacher at graduate level, and I agree with Chomsky where he said this about MIT, I think you should know the capability and the style of those handful of students who sit around your table as they sat around Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus,
Yeah.
just to win a Dutchman. Okay. I mean, you could know that. I mean, I could sense, you know, like people have been doing this. We've caught people publishing. We used to have the Turnitin before. So we used to catch people if you quote. I once failed a thesis. I had to, because it's cheating. Come on now. I mean, you know, I want to see your work. But I once, your work, I mean, the students' work. I remember I had a student and I picked up a few lines which I were very familiar. And they were probably from Paulo Freire. And I know those words. I've read Paulo Freire quite well. With limitations, of course, but I picked them up. So I go to the library. This was before we had internet at the time.
Of course, yeah.
I just come back from Toronto. I finished my PhD. And I know where this was. It was Peter McLaren's edited book with Peter Leonard, Paulo Freire, Critical Encounter. Pick up the book from the library. Would you believe it? Huge chunks. At the time, you would take so long to wait for a book to arrive at the library, and I want everybody to use it. But this one destroyed the whole book, chunks, and tell somebody or her boyfriend, because it was she, her boyfriend, to type this part, and gave me the assignment. I had no option but to flunk this person.
Yeah, yeah.
I said, listen, don't expect any favors from me about this.
Yeah.
Apart from this, you have done something terrible, because this is a resource in an institution, the library, which represents, as far as I'm concerned, I learned this from David Livingston, my PhD supervisor, the socialization of knowledge production. And you have destroyed it. Now, to get another copy of that, this is before electronic things, we have to wait another few months, because this is a destroyed book. You have no respect for the work itself.
Yeah.
Boy, was I furious. And I kept it away from the librarian. But I told him many years later, and you know, he became red. He told me, why didn't you tell her? Send her to me next time.
Wow.
Give her a piece of my mind.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah. Now we're more sophisticated. So we had turned it in. Hopefully we will now have another mechanism, right? With technology, maybe Dutch technology comes into it, where we can actually detect what these things are. But for the moment,
Well, it already exists.
we're in for a rough ride.
Well, there are already programs. There's already software that detects artificial intelligence. There's a way of detecting artificial written. Yeah. So
yeah, but we're going to have a world of good people, because they will always be there. But we're going to what people call zombies, what Henry Giroux called zombie culture, because you see zombies. I mean, you can get through a program, you know, like without actually picking up anything from there. And it's not just because of the way of teaching, as Chomsky said, that's already a problem, what he called miseducation. But even worse than that now, I mean, it's bringing robotics into education, sort of. You know, and so where's the education? What have you taken, you know, what have you gotten out of this? Yeah. Now, let me tell you, I have to say that for somebody like myself, coming from an island like Malta, with all its splendors and all its good points, it's not just negative. There's a lot of good points about Malta. Okay. Internet, for all the problems, and I've written about the problems of internet, and I am against too much technology in education, but it has been an opening for us. This is how I did my projects. This is how I published my books. It was an opening. It's internet. I can actually be international working from home in Malta. I don't have to relocate to London or to one of these hegemonic centers, never mind Paris, okay? To London, which I find arrogant about people saying, critical people supposedly. How come he's never been to a place like London? He operates from Toronto. Can you believe that? Someone has told me, a great critical person, very well read in our area from England. He's not like in a world's intellectual center like London. Oh my God. I said, you've got so much problematizing to deal with, my dear. As a guy whose books we used to read as undergrads, he was one of the, but I won't mention the name, but I'm feeling people can figure it out. But anyway, everything passes through London, it does. But to say that a person who's based in Toronto, how come he's there? A person of his stature. I mean, Toronto, for Christ's sake. But what about the great, brilliant scholars who come out of Africa? I have been producing great stuff.
Yeah.
The kind of people I've met, even in Toronto, with their bases, their formation in Africa, and the kind of knowledge that they produce, which is at the furthest remove from what you get from these intellectual centers. Yeah, even we academics, we have this kind of colonial attitude, which
certainly. And when you look at the big names in critical pedagogy, Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, Paulo Freire, Peter Mayo, they're all affluent, white, middle-aged men. Where are the Africans? So you refer to where are they? Because
first of all, I come from a small country called Malta, so you can't put me on the same. But anyway, critical pedagogy, as Henry Giroux has been emphasizing, did not start with us white men there. It has been there, but under different names. What's in a name? Romeo once asked, what's in a name? It has been going on since time immemorial. I mean, the definition you read has been going on since the time of the ancient Greeks, and probably the tribal knowledge and indigenous knowledge in Africa. There is. Of course, it is coming true. It has been coming true more recently in history. But the impact of indigenous knowledge on critical education, pedagogy, call it whatever you like, is being felt right now. Remember also, even in the so-called Western centers of knowledge, there is an influx now of scholars coming from the geographical majority world, and they bring these cultures with them, and they bring the kind of, even in radical environments, they're either radical or become more radicalized, that you never know where this is going to end. I was in an institution in Toronto, yes, white, male, it was not actually, it was very feminist oriented. And the amount of indigenous knowledge, which was promoted by African students over there, when I was there, it may not be the same today. Because I went there a couple of years ago, and oh my God, it's been, it's changed completely. And there was a huge, and one of the greatest scholars I remember as a student. I mean, we were students. He was in curriculum, I was in sociology. But we used to follow the same stuff because they were very similar. I mean, he was under the influence of Roger Simon, great critical pedagogue, American Jew. I was under David Livingston, working with it, but we were in, two radical departments. Handel, Kashope, Wright. He's now a professor at UBC. I mean, there were some really brilliant people I've met amongst fellow students in Toronto, men and women, and people of different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. I mean, another brilliant person who's still at the University of Toronto is a prof. He was very young at the time, 25-year-old. Was, I don't know if you heard, Rinaldo Walcott, a Bajan from Barbados originally. These are brilliant people. They've been producing brilliant stuff. Now, this is one institution. So let's not underestimate other institutions. But what I want to see now, and I hope there is, greater space being given to people who remain ensconced in the country of origin, not just those who leave and make it and probably never go back. But that's what I'd love to see. And of course, there's a lot going on. But are we prepared to look at that? I just organized, for example, of course, whatever you do is always limited. And it doesn't mean, I got it right, because my conscience keeps telling me I have great difficulty in falling asleep in bed, and therefore my conscience comes out. So I see all my sins coming out. So I know my limitations there, but I've organized, for example, this year was Julius Nyereri's centenary last December, so not this year. Last year was, we had a lot of African scholars, many of them from Tanzania itself or Kenya, not just people ensconced elsewhere. People who are ensconced elsewhere do great stuff because they bring in a new discourse into that place. Just think of the impact of a person who became a British subject, but a British citizen, but was from Jamaica, Stuart Hall, a middle-class Jamaican, as he himself says, okay? But look at his impact. Look at the impact of other people. Look at the impact of people from the diaspora, several generations. Think of the greatest intellectuals in the United States. For me, Toni Morrison, Angela Davis, Cornel West. I mean, they all have a heritage. But even the people ensconced in Africa, I mean, there's I took part in a discussion. I was invited, and I was flattered by it, by Africans at a university in the United States. But they have the center, which is global, and they get great African scholars from everywhere discussing colonialism. And that was great. So what we have to do, what I think is important, that yes, we listen to different voices, but also try to connect with me as a white person, I'm talking about now, from my standpoint, connect with people in Africa. So we're getting some even as keynote speakers to our critical education conference. In Malta, for example, we get Akile Mibembe. There's a European graduate school who used to be here. He comes from Cameroon. I don't know which place he's in right now, but of course, he's French speaking. But, this is the kind of stuff to which we must be exposed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, nobody has a prerogative over intellectual work.
And not just in speaking engagement, but also in the publishing world. More books, more papers from the global south.
And less expensive ones at that.
Yeah,
which makes it prohibitive for people coming from certain contexts. Okay, the context also be in the West, by the way, because there's a third world and the first world. Remember, you know that there's a periphery in Europe. We know that because the way certain people we claim as migrants, live in a peripheral existence. Many of them.
They do, yeah.
To the mainstream, even denied citizenship, which means denial of rights. And that is one of the assumptions that my colleague, Maria Pisani, she's from youth studies in the university, but we have collaborated. She wrote a brilliant thesis, in fact, for PhD. And also we wrote a piece together about migration. She knows more than me because she's very much into migration. She has saved many people's lives. And she's not just the white Western savior. You know what I mean? She gave a lot. In fact, she fell back on her, she fell behind on her publications because she spends more time doing this. Many women, she wrote a paper in Education and Power, questioning the citizenship assumption in critical pedagogy. And she was talking about rejected asylum seekers, women asylum seekers from Somalia. Rejected. This is an empirical work. And looking at policies. There are people, we take citizenship for granted. Where there are so many people here in every country which have no access to citizenship rights.
Yeah. So
I'm sure you in Holland have many of these.
Oh, we do. We do. We have lots of people from Poland, from Bulgaria, but also from Africa. Who live in the periphery of Dutch society. It reminds me, when you say there's a third world and the first world as well, it reminds me of George Orwell's book, Road to Wigan Pier. Do you know that book of George Orwell?
Not really. I've read George Orwell's works, but
he was living as a miner, as a coal miner for a while, just to see how these people are treated. And your quote, what you're saying reminds me of those people who make long working days, who have no rights, who live in tiny rooms, who die very early.
Yes.
It's
There's a famous novel
yeah,
published. You know about this for sure in
yeah,
England, published by an Irish person. You know, the Irish suffered a lot also as
yeah,
migrants. You go to Glasgow.
yeah.
I mean, the Irish in Glasgow, on the east side of Glasgow, amongst the poorest of the poor, the football team Celtic was created to alleviate the poverty amongst Irish migrants. It was founded by a priest over there, whose picture is at the famous stadium. Okay, that's the east side of Glasgow. There's the famous book by, it's a novel by, the real name was, I believe, because, you know, it could be rejected eventually, Robert Nuhan, who uses a pen name, Robert Tressel. It's called The Ragged Trousers Philanthropist. This was England in Edwardian times, living from hand to mouth, living from hand to mouth. And I think we're going back there. You're talking about migrants. You are talking about highly educated people whose formal education is not recognized. And we've seen this in Malta. Okay, even research, and Maria tells me a lot about these things because she also used to run an NGO. I think it's still operating now. And then you also have people like ourselves, formally educated, some with doctorates, who also live that kind of existence, which raises issues about the working class today. You look at places, I have to give you Malta, but I think of Italy as just one example. It happens everywhere.
Yeah, sure.
The precarious existence, precariat, I call it. I used to use the French word, précarité. Highly qualified people who have no jobs,
yep,
live from hand to mouth, who only have contracts for a limited time, following which they're fired. And they know there's no way out of it, okay? And they probably rely on their professor who gives them a few crumbs in the form of a couple of classes, and that's it. How can you plan your life? You know, we've been fed a lot of bullshit over the years. And this has been the bee in my mind, the bullshit of lifelong learning. It's one of the most abused, overused to the point of nausea terms in education over the last few years.
Why?
Because it used to be a beautiful concept, but with very little impact on policy once, and promoted by UNESCO, which had idealistic and somewhere more on the ground, and it used to be called lifelong education, which had its problems, because talking about self-directed learning, you know, the new Robinson Crusoe sort of person has to be entrepreneurial, etc. But at least it had an idea, a broad concept of education. However, it did not translate into concrete things because UNESCO did not have the money, the carrot to go ahead with it. Enter the OECD and the European Union, and they've turned it into the one of the most hegemonic terms we have in education. I won't say it's the most, but one of the most. And I wrote a book with Leona English on this. Leona English is a Canadian friend of mine, colleague from Nova Scotia. She's actually from Newfoundland, but she was raised in, she's a professor in Nova Scotia. We wrote a book about this. One of the small books by Prager. Again, global publishing houses with all the problems, contradictions. And basically, we debunk that notion. We call it from Macbeth. You know, a bit of literature. It's not bad. Yeah, I mean, come on. We use also popular culture a lot, huh? For me, this division is often problematic between hype. The serpent beneath the innocent flower. It looks so innocent. Lifelong learning, so innocent. As a former rector once told me, we're not going to complain about that. Well, that's the problem. It depends what you mean by it. Of course, we're going to complain. It is very, because it is very neoliberal in its concept. It's been turned into a neoliberal concept, which means that forget the welfare state, which is vanishing. If you fall by the wayside, it's your fault. Pick up your bootstraps, continue learning, which means often continuing learning, keep forking out money or taking loans. And of course, we know this is a whole joke, because what we have in the world is a crisis of jobs. We know that capitalism, now we don't have the time to go into, and I'm not even the best person to answer this, goes through cycles. And we present what is a skills crisis, a jobs crisis, the inability to create jobs as a skills crisis, which means rather than looking at capitalism and questioning the whole capitalist system and how it does depotentializes people, disempowers people, but keeps blaming them for the lack of jobs rather than the system itself. So it's a jobs crisis presenting as a skills crisis. And this goes back a long time. In 1974, Ivor Berg published a book called The Great Trading Robbery. You put people into training, you narrow, because you need this kind of education to be able to get a job. By the time you finish that program, the jobs are not there. The skills have changed. What's even worse, and here is a very good book based probably even on secondary data, of course, but never mind. I mean, both in Gintis also, schooling in capitalist society was based on secondary data. What they do is basically, it's called the broken promises of education. It pushes people into certain professions, giving them the illusion that they're going to live a particular life. By the time what they don't tell you is that masses of people, highly qualified, but prepared to work for low pay, come out of India and particularly Southeast Asia, and they flood the global markets. By doing so, they're putting down the price of work. Now, I'm not blaming them, I'm blaming the whole system, because they are probably first-class engineers, but their expectations are lower. So where's the lifestyle for which you studied? It's a big illusion. It's an illusion. It's deceitful. It's the serpent. It's pernicious. It's the serpent beneath the innocent flower. This is the famous expression. You probably know that from Shakespeare, from Macbeth.
Yeah.
When Lady Macbeth tells Macbeth, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent underneath. And this is what we're having. So yeah, lifelong learning, the way it's been twisted and turned around, and is still hegemonic, is one of the most pernicious concepts we have today. And I've written a lot about this, and I will never stop writing.
How do we get rid of it?
Students, don't fall for such cliches, for such innocent sounding terms, because there is always a pernicious element beneath. There's always something beneath. What is beauty is not beautiful at all.
How do we get rid of lifelong learning then? What's your solution?
Well, it's the way you present it and what you emphasize. I mean, the discourse on lifelong learning is all about the market. So be a lifelong learning to succeed through the market. The market doesn't give a damn about people who don't succeed. I mean, who's going to take care of them? When we whittle down the social state, what in England used to call the welfare state, right? We whittle that down. In some places, it's non-existent. United States, despicable. Malta has still, but there are still big problems. Of course, it's not what it used to be in the 70s. We leave everything to the market. Before, there was a state which regulated. Now, what happens? You had a kind of right-wing discourse, the Nanny State, Margaret Thatcher, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yes.
And people believe these cliches are things that people talk about. How beautiful I used to hear people. What a wonderful way. If you think education is expensive, listen to this. Try ignorance. people believe, they embrace this kind. What it's meaning is you're gonna pay for it. You're gonna pay. So how do we keep churning out these kind of inane statements, which appear to be nice?
Peter,
everything.
What is the alternative?
Alternative? Be truthful about things. Say things as they are. I mean, what do we do in research? What do people do in what I consider to be good research? Now, of course, that depends on your values. The way I look at something is different from the way somebody else will look at it. If I and Trump are in the same room, we look at the same thing very differently because our values are different. Be honest about it. Teach lifelong learning, for example, for what it is. I mean, this is what we do. That's why I produced that book. Some people are going to hate me for it. And I'm not the only one. Many people are saying these things as well. Huh? I mean, come on.
How's that going to solve the job crisis? Because it's in essence, it's a job crisis, just like you said.
Well, that raises a whole issue. I'm not saying, and I've said this we said this in our book, do away with vocational education. That will be irresponsible. But this overemphasis on one aspect of education to the total neglect of other things is problematic. Now, I'll give you an example. What are those who are concerned with capitalism itself? But the problem is they don't want to transcend capitalism. I'm like Henry Giroux. I believe in a vision which transcends the capitalist framework. Okay? For me, capitalism will be, and I think it will be, but not in my lifetime, for sure, will be transcended. It is very, 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 unlike other, like the old feudal system, it is very resilient. I mean, I had a supervisor who was a political economist, David Livingston. He was very emphasis about it. It also always finds ways of making the opposition part of its own discourse. Say, for example, look at how they use in a more banal way today's revolutionary as tomorrow's commercial icon. Che Guevara, symbol of revolution. Now you find squash watches, they remove them from the Smirnoff, whatever, energy drink, revolutionary. Yeah, how do you channel that revolutionary spirit in whose hands? And I think we have to do this kind of work. What captures people's imagination and make sure we channel it according to our values. We're not neutral. Nothing is neutral according to our values. I mean, my values will be despicable, like Donald Trump. Not that he's bothered about me, etc. I'm hardly a footnote, or a full stop. But is to generate an alternative way of lifelong learning, an alternative conception of lifelong learning, namely learning to understand relations between not just human beings, not just important, but not just, because we are not the only creatures on Earth, but the rest of the cosmos. Now, the United Nations has embraced the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I've had students who have been critical of them because they see them as very Eurocentric, but I'm not going to go into that. I argue, and this is one of the keys, if we are going to take that road, if we are going to lifelong learning for sustainable development, because to get to know about what is sustainable development, what is more a healthier human rest of the earth relations, because we are also humans, part of the earth. Not only, but we are rooted there. We are not apart from, as Marx had denounced capitalists. They separate human beings from capital, from resources, so that they can be exploited. But we are rooted there. If we're going to take that route, then, of course, this whole discourse of lifelong learning, this whole baggage, 1990 onwards, has to be toppled. Because how do you have sustainable development if that's the right word we should use? Some people have questioned that too. But let's just use it. We have to grapple onto something which exists. You know, people make change. People can make change collectively. They can make change. But as Marx said, in the 18 Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, everybody will probably cite this, not under conditions of your own making. So you have to engage dialectically with what is, with the material basis, and which is what Marx himself does. That's his method, as part of his method. So basically, we have to, if these words capture people's imagination, then we're going to turn them around. And this is what Leon and I try to do in our book. The book is called Lifelong Learning, Global Social Justice and Sustainability.
So
by doing that, we have to, sorry, just a second, I want to conclude this. This means, basically, how do we relate to the rest of the cosmos as human beings? Meaning, the good life should not be a set of policies confined to a particular space to the detriment of the rest, because what happens here has ramifications elsewhere. So you can create a socialist paradise within a country or a region, but that paradise is built on the backs of other places. So one thing is the goal which transcends capitalism. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in our lifetime. But we move there is to destroy the unequal relationship between North and South. First of all, we have to keep in mind that even North...
Define North and South.
Okay, big question. Very good question. I always place them in inverted commas. Because actually, there's no such thing which comes out from, I don't know, heaven, whatever, you know, called North and South. What is South to us and we take for granted, or North to us, which we take for granted, which means hegemonically Northern Western thinking, could have been North to somebody else. Do you know? You've probably been to Spain. Have you ever been to Spain?
Yes.
Have you been to Sevilla?
Yes.
You go to the Alcatraz. Obviously, you go there. You go to the minaret turned into a church belfry, La Giralda, and next to it you got the Alcatraz. And that's, you know, it's a Muslim Arab house. You have the same thing in Cordoba. Now I get them mixed up.
Mesquita de Cordoba. Yeah, nice.
Have you looked at the map?
No.
During the Arab times, the Moorish times, it's the Mediterranean, as seen from Arab eyes. The Arabs, the spread of is going down towards what we consider to be the north as being on the south. So that's a big question. Who defines what is north and what is south? Who defines, and here I'm repeating what Edward Said had been saying for a long time, who decides that that part of the world is the Middle East? You know, that part is the Far East. That means if you are doing that, you're creating a center from the center.
Yeah.
The center is obviously the people who have cultural hegemonic power. Those are the ones who are probably the ones who had technology which subdued other nations, which is always the case. And of course, became. I mean, even if you look at Europe itself, Europe and North Africa, and a bit of Asia, what we call the basin where I come from, the Mediterranean. Malta is an island in that basin, right? Even there, you've seen a shift. That was a center of hegemonic power, but it's not anymore. Post 1492, it lost its importance. And then in Helsinki, 1976, that was the Conference on Security and Cooperation in the Mediterranean, a politician from my country, who for some people is like a god, for others, he's the demon incarnated, made a big intervention in Helsinki and put the Mediterranean as part of the discourse and would not sign, it had to be unanimous, he would use that power not to sign that unless they put this issue, what they call the Mediterranean chapter. All of a sudden, the Mediterranean got back into international relations. Before, it was all about East and West, Ostpolitik, you know, and now it came back. But the Mediterranean lost its supremacy in public perception because of it lost its power. The power shifted towards the north.
You know,
South. So how do I define? North and South are relative terms. They are construct. Just the Mediterranean is a construct. Europe is a construct.
Yeah, of course, yeah. You know, a couple of
constructs,
months
but based on power.
A couple of months ago, I interviewed Jane Elliott. Do you know Jane Elliott? Her work?
No, but I heard her interview. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and at the end of the interview,
I think she mentioned this. Yes, I remember.
About the world map, and she said there was a cartographer, and there was a pope who mandated a world map in which the North or the Northern Europeans were depicted as the biggest countries on planet Earth that would justify their dominance in the world.
It reminds me of The King and I, Yul Brynner, the map. Yeah, but I mean, no, I of course, one has to, I want to read some interesting, serious stuff. Why is it that people who see themselves in a position of power, because let's face it, even the Arabs, you know, they were in a position of power in that part of the world. They picked it. This was the great golden age, they call it. It's very romanticized. These golden ages are romanticized. But they call it the golden age of Arab culture, which was actually what is interesting, unlike European colonialism. It's not like French colonialism or Britain or other places where the center is Belgium, Brussels, Portugal, Lisbon, Spain, Madrid, before Toledo. England, Britain, England, actually London, or what's the other one? You know, or Rome. Rome is Rome, but it was they created the cultural centers, not in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, what today is Mecca, what is today is Saudi Arabia, but in what today is Spain. The center was Cordoba. And you had, this is according to what historians say, and not one or two, okay, both European and Arab scholars, you had that was the center of the part of the world which was known at the time. Cordoba, you had Jews, Muslims, and Christians interacting together. And if it wasn't for many of them, particularly Jews and most particularly Muslims, Arabs, because people conflate Muslim with Arab, which is bad. You know, not every Arab is a Muslim, majority. Not every Muslim is an Arab. Okay? Yeah. And they conflate those two. The things that people who have hegemonic thinking, Eurocentric thinking, consider to be put on a pedestal, as Frantz Fanon says, the Greco-Roman pedestal. If it weren't for the Arabs, we would not have received that knowledge. They translated everything. And apparently even Jews too, in Cordoba. This is where you had this translation. This is the This is the time of Ibn Rushd, Averroes.
Yeah.
Come on.
Well, let's end with this question. You know, critical pedagogy. It's still.
How would I define this?
My main interest. My main interest. So tell me, why is critical pedagogy relevant in 2023? Why should we all pay attention to it? Why should we all read and dig into it? Tell me.
Critical pedagogy, if you ask anybody, 9 times out of 10, what would you expect a child to have, your child, from education? Oh, open his mind, open her mind, become critical. However, when push comes to shove, we don't like that. As long as they are critical, but not with us.
That's true, yeah.
And you know, it's more than that, because then they themselves put pressure on their own children not to be critical. I mean, I've heard this in my family, and I've heard this elsewhere. You're going to make yourself a lot of enemies. You are gunning for a first class undergraduate, because I was hopeless at school. I picked up, I consider myself academically a late developer, as many who are in my classroom will tell you. You are gunning for a first class. This kind of attitude, like taking up issue with the dean and whatever, as students, that's going to work against you. So we always then tell them to be non-critical. Keep your mouth shut. You talk too much. Like that case of the music. Who were they? Those people who denounced Bush for the wars in Iraq, the Dixie Chicks. Shut up and sing was the manager's statement to them, right? Keep your mouth shut. Not only that, they're very proud parents. Bell Hooks has an interesting piece about this, keeping closer to home. And I always tell my students, the students I've worked with, sorry, not mine, undergrads, to become teachers. And I said, most of us come from a working class family. I mean, my father was a son of an English soldier stationed in Malta. I think my mother was lower middle class, but he came from working class, but he had status because he came from an English family. Colonial thinking, Never mind the fact that they were working class in London, which ironically is where my daughter went back to, the same area, North London. And they're proud because you made it to university. I was the first one on my side of the family to go to university. My wife, the first. She's the oldest of 3 children, and she was the first. They all went to university. She was the first one to go. She broke the tradition of the family. They used to go to the dockyard before, the dock work. If that's not working class, I don't know what is. Anyway, and you go there, and they're proud of you. And our faculty, teachers are traditionally, not everybody, but traditionally, they come from public school teachers. They come from the working class. In Eric Olin Wright's terms, they have a contradictory class consciousness because they can harken back to the working class because that's how they've been raised. But education and formal education and relative success in the formal education system gives them a kind of middle class demeanor. That's what university does to you, right? I mean, Gramsci criticized Benedetto Croce because through his kind of language, the kind of language promoted amongst philosophers at university, he took potential organic intellectuals of the working class away from them because he imbued them with a new language, the language of academia, the language of of great culture. And basically, I said, mostly you're working class, so many of them even have manual work in the background, the family. I said, and they're very proud of you because you made it. You bought out of your class, so to speak. Problematic. But today, it's very difficult to create that class consciousness because we define our freedom not through a collectivity, as in the past, as England once had in the past. You had an industrial working class and you would be proud. No, I fall into debts to buy the latest fashion to define myself and position myself in relation to you. That's how we find our freedom. That's a big problem. So that's so many people are in a working class situation because they become déclassés, but they don't admit it. They keep up appearances. They don't admit it. However, when I asked my students, I said, so they're very proud of you, except when you're at table and you engage in an argument with your dad. And what 9 times out of, and all the students would do this with their heads. Like, who the hell do you think you are? Because you've read a few books, because you've gone to university, and then he's got the University of Life and things like that. I've worked hard, and you owe it to me that we created this family so that you can go to university. And then you forget about being proud about your daughter. You're sitting on your pompous ass, and just read. And I find that And this is often triggered off by a paper or a set reading I used to give prospective teachers. They still love it, by bell hooks. You know.
The late bell hooks.
Yeah, I mean, that book, Talking Back, is not the only book I read by her. She's written some good stuff. She's written also what I consider to be overproduced, overdone. Like the publishing houses want her to produce another book. You know, we want another record like this to be successful. I didn't like her teaching community, for instance. I thought she wastes so much time talking about how tired she is. Yeah, well, this proves it. You know, I mean, that's what I said. But you know, yeah, I mean, that book it's ideal because it's not, there's no bullshit in the language. Very beautiful, flowing English, as it should be written. Simple but not simplistic, and nothing highfalutin. She has other good stuff, of course, especially teaching to trans guests, and her early work as well, Anti-Woman, and Feminism from Margin to Center. I think, you know, but I think she wrote too much at a certain stage to keep up with the industry, which is probably what I'm doing myself, but I'm not bell hooks, of course. I'm not of that caliber. And basically, just what I want to say, this triggers off this discussion. It's an essay in Talking Back called Keeping Close to Home, where she also talks about she used to stay there because she couldn't afford to go home. And then she used to mix with the cleaners who are there, etc. You know, she combines gender, sexuality, class, and race. That's what I like about her work. Intersectionality is very strong in bell hooks. And they all agree on this, you know, like it's this friction between teachers who are from a working class origin, but are now imbued with a kind of demeanor reflected in the language and the way they go about things, argue about things, even academia, even how the way they think. For example, I remember somebody from my family who was doing a master's degree, and her partner didn't go to university, very intelligent guy. And when he starts coming up with all kinds of story, you have to be rigorous. She tells him, you have to be, you have to, you know, this kind of stuff. And that infuriates people of an older generation, like your parents, who can't tolerate it anymore. This reminds me of Frantz Fanon in Black Skin and White Masks. But somebody goes to France and starts pronouncing French the way he thinks, it's a he in this case, the French speak, which they immediately put you in your place, as they did to Frantz Fanon himself. You know, and he comes back and sort of becomes playful with his father, trying to show off that he's been to Paris. All of a sudden, things become second class. So whatever this thing is on the floor in a farmer's place, he says, what do you call this, by the way? And his dad, you know, is infuriated. You're telling me what you call, you've been brought up on this. So what he does says nothing, his father, a typical working class, peasant class kind of philosophy, witticism, attitude. He just drops it on his foot. All of a sudden, says Frantz Fanon, and I read this in translation in English. It comes back to the person after he's dropped it on a clanger on his foot. Wonderful therapy. Frantz Fanon. That's how he puts it out. Wonderful therapy. The amnesia goes away. You know? So
that's a really long answer. So the question was the relevance of critical pedagogy in.
So how did I get here? Is basically we want critical pedagogy. We want our children. Yes, we want them to be critical. You know that this is wrong, don't you? You're intelligent, they tell you, but it means you have to agree with them. Their politics, basically. As long as the critical element is not used against you, or brings you into trouble. So it's something that people want, but when push comes to shove, they prevent it by the advice they give you. Okay, nobody wants his child to be a martyr. Now, if he becomes a martyr and he's gone and you can't bring him back, then of course you cry, but you have at least that crumb of comfort. But you're not going to allow them to do that, you know? So it's what people want. Now, whether you call it critical, but now this is the important thing. Henry Giroux, for example, insists on critical pedagogy because he thinks it has a certain resonance, etc. Okay, I can see that, but I'm not too sure. You know, call it critical education, call it critical pedagogy, call it praxis, the Greek word, which goes back to Aristotle's time, reflection upon action, not just doing things, being in the trenches. Henry Giroux, I know he spoke about this, but there has to be an intellectual element, thinking element. Gramsci says anybody who really works hard on something has a thinking element. Every man is a philosopher, every person. He says every man is a philosopher, but he doesn't have the function of being a philosopher. Just because you sew a thing, it doesn't make you a tailor. Okay, just because you boil an egg doesn't make you a cook. But he says that. So we want that. That's praxis. Reflect upon action, and which often brings even then I will engage with the theory to create new theory. This shouldn't. I don't agree with the way it's put. I would adjust that kind of term and change it. So that is praxis. You can call whatever you like. The Greeks called it praxis. They called it other stuff. You know, call it philosophy in the broader sense, the way Gramsci used the word philosophy, the study of philosophy. Systematic, doing away with the contradictions from common sense to good sense. Common sense has good sense, but it can be obscured by contradictory elements, contradictory consciousness. That's critical pedagogy for me.
Is there room for critical pedagogy in let's say primary education and secondary education? Since education is taken hostage by standardized testing, punitive accountability, rigid curriculum.
Yes. You want to say something? Sorry, because
I'm always wondering, you know, Paulo Freire was an educator outside of a school building. He educated peasants and poor
he created schools with his policies as Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo, and he changed the curriculum.
He did, but would Paulo Freire be able in this era to teach critical pedagogy in a, let's say, a high school?
Yes, I have this image for all it's worth, but this is as far as my mind goes. You know, this is what I've written this in a number of my books. And it's a repetitive thing on my part. It's my way of. I see a real critical pedagogue, she or he or they, as somebody who's caught. It's not a happy situation. Huh? Education is not to make you happy. I don't buy that. It could make you very sad because you know more.
Yeah.
Greater responsibility. Okay? And I'll give you an example later on culture about this. But I see a critical pedagogue is being bombarded by things which are anti-critical pedagogue, which is what you are getting at. Curriculum, syllabus, time on task, you know, like in the factories, deadlines, exams, whatever. So you are ends of a continuum from banking education. The easiest way, this is the syllabus, go and do it. You know, this, and show me. And I'm going to assess you. And you have to pass the exam. Otherwise, I'm not a very good teacher because half my class failed. Anyway. And then on the other side, you've got the vision of the critical pedagogy, which is probably very idealistic because it's a goal which keeps you going, but you're never going to get there 100%, like in everything in life, right? Like a classless society. You know, it's going to happen. It's a goal. It's a utopia. You want to move towards this end. But there are wind forces which are buffeting you. They are throwing you to the other end. Every time, it's like Sisyphus. You want the stone to go up and it comes down again. For me, a critical pedagogue is to accept that confrontation between the reality, which pushes you backwards, and moving towards that goal, which probably transcends the present reality, capitalism, and capitalist schools and capitalist curricula. I think once you accept that struggle, you'll be doing a lot of good, because something is going to change along the way, but not in the way you want it, 100%, because life is like that. So it's to accept that confrontation between one end of the curriculum and the other end. Now, the teacher who wants to take an easy life, he doesn't want to have responsibility, he or she, or, just wants to go with the flow, doesn't make an effort. This is what works. This is what works. But it's not what works. What should work? What should and can be, not what is. Possibility. And therefore, you're going to move, but you're going to face lots of forces against you. Many of the critical pedagogues who have struggled against the grain, Paulo Freire himself, Lorenzo Milani, made a lot of enemies along the way. Lorenzo Milani with the authorities and with the church itself. He was sent to an island. He was sent to a mountain far from, what's the expression? Away from sight.
Out of sight.
No, we have. There's a famous. We have a paper, me and Maria, about this Pisani. That's the title, actually. Anyway, we use it for migrants. These deals they're doing, keeping them in Libya, places like that. Okay, and basically, I could even. I'm at an age right now where I have lapses. Like I could even struggle to remember my grandchild's name. You know what I mean? Yeah. Far from sight, far from mind. There's an expression like that. It's not like that exactly, but anyway, it's not.
Out of heart, out of sight?
Out of sight, out of mind. That's it. Out of sight, out of mind. We use it for a paper about keeping migrants at bay. Keeping migrants out of sight by paying places like Libya, like they did in Australia with Papua New Guinea, making construction, development to keep migrants there, not to keep them there. Out of sight, out of mind. That's it. Such a simple expression. I got blocks because my mind wants to. So you have the situation here where you have to fight these forces. And many of the great critical pedagogues suffered as a result. And you have to suffer. If you are not suffering, then you are not being serious. Then you are a dog which doesn't bite. Yeah. If you suffer, this dog doesn't bite because, you have to. So if you're not getting reprisals and you are being ostracized, I mean, one way you suffer, the worst part is to ignore you. To ignore you. People who are indifferent. Gramsci used to say, I hate indifferent, odioli indifferenti. Even Don Milani used to say, not to be taken literally, of course, better a fascist than indifferent. He has nothing about, this is it. So critical pedagogy, yes, is living critically, but being prepared to suffer because of that selection you have made. You have to. I always ask my students, the big question is, what is the price you have to pay for this? And of course, depending on the context, you can get killed for doing that. Not far away from Malta, there's Sicily. Now, that doesn't mean there's organized crime, right? Traditionally, is to be organized crime all over, it even is in Malta, right? Don't believe it. If you become very, very uncomfortable, scomodo, as they say in Italian, you could be bombed off. We had a journalist who was killed here in Malta. Speaking truth to power, and this is where the Semana Santa comes in, with its images, St. John the Baptist. Speaking truth to power could make you lose your head. You're gambling with your head. Not with your teeth only, but with your head also. Yeah, yes, I am under no illusion that being a good critical pedagogue is going to be fun, because it's not. Because it's not. You make a lot of enemies. People keep you away. Here in Malta, they don't kill you. They kill you there's another way, by ignoring you. Okay, you're out of the limelight. You could be hugging the wavelength on radio. You can be hugging the airwaves. Sorry, you can be hugging by being hegemonic in yourself, in the kind of language you use. Go with the flow. I know people who are like that, using the media. Okay, but if you're going to say things which are you are not going to be given that space. I mean, I worry about Chomsky at times because some of the things that he reveals in his work goes beyond the normal academic, the kinds of things he reveals. But I don't know, I don't know, but he's lived long enough now. On the other hand, you are not going to make yourself popular. And the education, the uncomfortable truths you have to deal with, doesn't make the education a happy experience. Let me give you an example. In Malta, like in many countries like Holland, etc., there is a lot of heritage which we brag about. Spain, you go to the churches, you go to the museums, a lot of gold and silver, right? Beautiful stuff. You go to Sevilla, the first thing you go is to the cathedral, and the most impressive thing is probably the altar, apart from the fact there's one of 3 places which claim to have the body of Christopher Columbus or Cristobal Colon, all right, Cristobal Colon, but you have a gold 48 panels from the life paneles on a polyptych from the life of Christ. You probably saw that. There's a big attraction inside the cathedral, apart from the fact they say it's the widest cathedral on earth. And they have the Guinness Book of Records to show you. 48 panels from the life of Christ. Now, if you take that religion seriously and the life of Christ seriously, it's a big contradiction. Come to Malta. Malta had great Spanish influence. Knights of St. John, nobility of Europe, you name it, Spanish, Italian, you got silver and gold. They adorn our churches. Nobody asked the critical pedagogical question. We ask about the aesthetics. That's how we've been trained. Art, the aesthetics. We never asked the question that Raymond Williams asks, a white Welshman. The political economy of cultural production, which he writes about in Marx and based on superstructure, Marxist cultural theory, and throughout his essays in Marxism and literature, or other people raise, or Marx himself. We don't ask questions about the material in which these things of beauty are carved out. Where did they come from? Who extracted those things? Under what conditions and at what price? And you know the answer. Yeah. Many of them were enslaved local people in Latin America, indigenous people with a capital I, who were thrown into the pits. Yeah. They said they had no soul, so they're going to burn in hell. They might as well burn now. Yeah. They threw mercury inside to facilitate, never mind the fact they are maiming people for life, apart from killing them, or entombing them, as Marx says in Capital Volume 3. I think it's Capital Volume 3 where he says that. Okay? Anyway, all you have to do is read Eduardo Galeano.
That always reminds me of Tesla. People, when they drive a Tesla, I think they're doing the best for planet Earth, but sometimes they tend to forget that the batteries are made of lithium, and the way lithium is mined is very unfriendly to laborers, mostly children actually, who dig the mines, who go into the mines. But when you drive a Tesla here on the street, you're really good for planet Earth, and you have a green mind. And
and if you think about these things, the pleasure goes away. Now, I love art, and I did study art. I did my first degree dissertation. And I used to read in a very conventional way. This is what the art historians used to write. Your Michael Levy's, your Kenneth Clark. This is the kind of stuff I was brought up on. Now, they may have some more critical stuff, but I'm not aware of. But when I now see works of silver, this is not a thing of beauty anymore, because behind everything of beauty, there lies a tragedy. The serpent beneath the innocent flower. It's not innocent. It's not just innocent, not only opulent, but Many people have lost their lives digging this out because they were treated as subhuman, lesser beings, just like the Nazis treated Jews as lesser beings. Okay, they did this, and now we are enjoying the beauty. So places like our churches in Malta, I don't know, I have no proof that the silver came from Spain. Well, I would assume, because this were, but in Spain, there's no doubt. Sevilla, I mean, the Retablo Mayor, it's called, the panels, or you go to Rome. They brag about it, that this was brought by the conquistadors from Spain. You go to, I have to go after so many years, to the Basilica in Rome of Santa Maria Maggiore. That falls, historically has fallen, and still does, exactly under the royal family of Spain. They are the protectors of it. And one of the ceilings is full of gold. Gold brought, and they brag about it, brought over from the colonies in Latin America.
Latin America.
Also, especially with the Semana Santa, the gold things, they bring them from there. Gold and silver, Potosi in Bolivia. Nowadays it's now Bolivia, but it wasn't then. So I advise a book I like as much as Pedagogy of the Oppressed, as much as Letter to a Teacher, many other books, of course, or The Schooling Society of Illich, is Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. If that doesn't send shivers down your spine each time you see opulence in the form of silver and gold, I don't know what does. And it's actually the story of Europe. The Europe that you and I belong to, or we claim to belong to, because Malta is also Europe, but it's in the European Union. It is like the majority considers it to be European. I mean, that's the Europe we talk about. I mean, Max Weber actually starts off the Protestant ethic by making an ironic statement about the greatness of Europe, what is done to others. But Spain is a classic. This is a classic example. Now, to teach that, you're going to make a lot of enemies. When I asked a question once,
you don't have the opportunity to teach that in your classroom. When are you going to teach it? Do you have a jam-packed curriculum?
Well, you can do it with small children in primary, elementary school.
You have a jam-packed curriculum. You have 10
yes. But you're going to teach about culture and things like that. We in Malta, we even elementary schools, I used to go into the classes to see teachers. I used to teach at primary, but curriculum has changed. I used to go and see teachers, and they used to teach the Columbus Descubrimento, Discovery of America. It's one of the texts in Maltese. And being, coming from North America, my studies, etc. At the end of the day, I would ask the student teacher to show her how. Can I have a word with the kids? With the class. Could you allow me? Yeah, go ahead. And I started asking questions. And we start talking about indigenous people. And they started teaching me, because popular culture teaches them a lot. All they need, kids, as you know from a teacher, is a trigger. So we started talking about indigenous people. Okay, you have to make it more simple. Native Americans, the people who are there. Do you know what this is? Of course, Indians. Now then another kid says, sorry, that's not the right word. He must have been an immigrant coming back from Canada, Maltese return migrant. And you tell them that was based on a mistake. However, by Columbus, that's what they found in. But anyway, discussion. That's how I learned that Cher claims to have indigenous heritage, kids. They put two and two together. And then you begin to ask questions. Also, these people, the Spaniards went there, they found nobody. So the land they discovered, but was it discovered by others? No, never mind the Norsemen and all that stuff. The Scandinavians will tell you. And make them realize through questions, and they do come to that understanding. The student at the end, the student teacher will be, oh, I get what you're I now finally get what you're trying to do. You teach by proxy, you teach by giving her an example, but you don't dress her down. I don't blame her, because when I was a school teacher before I went to Canada, I would have done the same thing. And of course, the gold and silver comes in, because even you have a syllabus, It's what you teach and how you teach. And the more critical you are, the more likely, okay, the more likely is that they're going to come up with something very insightful, even in their exam, because they've thought about these things. Now, if you're teaching at a higher level, I think we have a greater responsibility. At university, I teach these things to undergrads. I've taught these things in my course, Learning Identity and Difference. Oh God, we have a whole section on post-colonialism. You know, we do the different, but never siloed. So yes, today we're focusing on gender and sexuality, but we can never get away from class. Intersectionality is throughout. That was one of the most rewarding classes that we developed it, revamped all the time. Me and a colleague who used to teach the same course, it was Friday actually, in primary, Mary Darmanin, I mentioned her, a sociologist, well known in British sociological circles. And of course, we used to teach the stuff and how. Now, it's an unpleasant feeling because something you've seen as a thing of beauty and you are proud of, especially in your own locality, where the silver is part of the people. In Malta, you have to understand that, the community and the church. A great work of art by an established painter. You'll find that the kind of painter you'll find in the Rijksmuseum or the Boymans in Rotterdam, all right, or the famous one in The Hague. All right, that kind of painting, put it in a museum, and they don't give a damn about it. But put that position in its original position inside a church, which is a parish church, that becomes part of the community, the parish. So the barrier between high culture and low culture is exposed for what it is, a false barrier. Okay? And the very same child who doesn't bother about Shakespeare, as my colleague Handel, who I mentioned, said, "What's Shakespeare doing in my barn?" He once told me. He wrote in his master's thesis, but that's what their attitude. All of a sudden, a painter like Mattia Preti, Calabrian painter, is very well known in Malta, has painted everywhere. Because he's in the parish, he becomes part of the popular culture. And even Mozart, and that because they play an instrument during the fiesta, and they have a concert and they play what we consider to be classical music in it, that becomes popular for them because it's part of the community, part of the fiesta. It's part of us. It's part of our community. And that's a whole discussion about different levels of cultural perceptions. But all of a sudden, the silver, which is often known by people from the community and which they gave to the church, when you start questioning these things, you're going to get lots of reactions.
Of course.
Some people will say the first thing, so what? What do you mean, so what? So what? Is it because it's detached by history years ago? Others, you knock the pleasure out of it, and you might have colleagues, as I did have. Should we teach these things to destroy people's pleasure? I said, education is not just about pleasure. Education is also about suffering. If you want a better world, a dialectical version of the past, look at the past and the suffering and how we are beneficiaries of that suffering so that we can likely, hopefully, become less inconsistent, incoherent, as prayer says, with an ultimate vision, which we will not realize in our earth, of having a better world. Redemptive memory. A great critical pedagogue wrote about that, Roger Simon. He's American. He was a professor at University of Toronto. He passed away a couple of years ago. Redemptive memory. He uses Walter Benjamin.
Well, you already referred to a couple of really nice titles. So let's end our conversation by mentioning some less familiar names. Let's say from the global south, perhaps, who deserve to be known as much as you do and Henri does. So let's come up with a couple of names which you.
Well, I've mentioned Julius Nyerere, Frantz Fanon. Are you including Latin America?
Yes, of course.
Paulo Freire, obvious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a bit more contemporary.
Or of the 50s, passed away in the 50s, a very Gabriela Mistral, whose actual name, she's a Nobel Prize winning poet, but she did a lot for education. She was poor. she was abandoned by her father at the age of 3. She became a rural educator and stuck up for rural education and indigenous education. Unlike the minister for whom she worked in Mexico, who had an attitude towards indigeneity, which was very problematic because he believed in mestizo, mixture with a superior race, which was the European race, of course. That's interesting. Her actual name is Lucila Godoy Alcaga. I think she's, if you discuss her with Latin Americans from Mexico, from everywhere, it's like mentioning Paulo Freire, you know?
Really?
Okay. Global South. Would you consider Sicily to be part of it?
Well, no, not really, but I think you do.
Well, yeah, well, but it's the south of the north. Yeah, there is Danilo Dolci. He's actually from the north, but he works in Palermo. Ibn Khaldun from Tunisia. We're talking about a 14th century Muslim.
Yes.
From whom Durkheim, according to Boaventura de Sousa Santos, took many ideas relating to his concept of solidarity, organic and mechanical. So, you know, Ibn Khaldun. Palestine has quite a number. I mean, Palestine has quite a number. Edward Said, he was raised in Egypt, but he's a Palestinian from a Anglo-Christian, Protestant, that is, Christian family background. Ibrahim Abu Lord and his daughters. Very good. They established themselves in America, but he went back and died in Ramallah and helped reorganize the curriculum in Palestine, right? With a Palestinian curriculum, which they didn't have before that. Because if you are from Gaza, you would have the Egyptian curriculum. If you were from the West Bank, Jordanian curriculum. So he developed, he spearheaded a group, it was a democratic process. But then the Israelis, with their occupation, destroyed everything inside the ministry. Nahla Abdo is from Palestine, but she lives she's a Palestinian from Israel, but she lives now in Ottawa. She's a professor at Carleton. Well, I mentioned Nyerere. I mentioned. I'm sure there's some really big one, which is
What about Asia? Because you mentioned Africa, Latin America, but you didn't mention any.
Okay, Asia, India, for example. I'm not going to mention Gandhi, the obvious one. Okay, there are big questions about Gandhi. I learned this from my Indian students. Now, real Indian students.
Well, give me one big question then.
No. People about his caste politics.
Oh.
People question his caste politics. And the thing I've learned from a colleague of mine, a former student, very good friend, no, not student of mine, we were students together, but then it was repeated by one of my students, one of the students I worked with in our international masters. So it came back, is that there's the Gandhi for foreign consumption and the Gandhi which Indians know. I'll leave it there.
I see.
The one great intellectual from India I would mention, well, Vandana Shiva. Okay, but there's one person I would mention, and that was Ambedkar. He's a Dalit, the untouchables, Dalit, the lowest of the low. But he struggled. He became actually became minister or prime minister. I'm not sure about that. I'm starting to be corrected. I need to read more about him. But what he was, he campaigned all his life to end the caste system. Ambedkar. Many people I know from India tell me he's the real intellectual of the subaltern. Subaltern, by the way, is a term used a lot in India. There's a Gramscian group in India with whom Gayatri Spivak, another person from Bengal, West Bengal, is involved, but probably not the major figure. which is the subaltern group. Looks at Indian history from a subaltern perspective. The key figure there is Ranayat Guha. You see, education, as in critical pedagogy, is not just teachers like yourself or as I was, or I am inside the classroom teaching. People, even policymakers, even, you know, who is the educator? Just look at Henry Giroux. He talks about schools. He has written, but he's been writing about cinema producers. You know, these are all educators. They all are concerned with perceptions. One of Italy's greatest educators who was murdered is Pasolini. You've heard about him, have you?
Yeah, we have.
Pier Paolo, you have films even I've seen by him,
Yep.
dubbed in The Hague. Pier Paolo Pasolini, he started off as a school teacher because that's what graduates did. Once you become a graduate with this particular specialization, you can teach in a school without teacher training. That's how it is in Italy.
Well, that's true. I mean, you teach art as well, about art. Let's take a famous band like Pink Floyd. We don't need no education. That's a private.
Well, not just that. I mean, are singers educators? I had a discussion with Henry Giroux, you know, online emails, and he mentioned Sam Cooke. He said, when I hear Sam Cooke, he's an educator. Even Etta James, he wrote about. But, you know, she's his favorite, probably. When she died, she wrote a beautiful tribute to her. Of course, Bob Dylan. Is Bob Dylan an educator?
Of course.
He wouldn't fancy himself as such, but he is. Stevie Nicks of not the Fleetwood Mac that I like, because I used to like the old Fleetwood Mac, the blues band. This was the time of Focus, by the way. Peter Green had just left. If she calls herself as an educator, as a teacher, yeah, I prefer the music of Peter Green, of course, the blues, because you know the blues band. Of course, I mean, great singers. Bob Marley. You ask anybody from the Caribbean, is just as important, if not more, than what's the famous Walcott, Derek Walcott, the poet. Okay, also there have been some accusations about him, but whatever, I don't want to go into that. That's sensational stuff. Or maybe I don't know enough. But yeah, I mean, but educators from India, there were many. Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet, was a national poet, Nobel Prize winner, but he was more than just a poet. He was an educator. He actually created schools, rural schools, for rural people. So he anticipated Nyerere with education for self-reliance. This is Tagore, and books have been written about him as an educator, and he also created the rural university, where you are also educating yourself not to be liberated from farming, but to become a liberated farmer. Notice the difference.
Yeah.
Your land, you love the soil, like Vandana Shiva speaks about, not for you to leave that land, to liberate yourself from that land, but to be liberated within that land. Okay? You can unravel that now.
Yeah, beautiful.
And there's another person who probably was a role model, chronologically speaking, I think there's a big similarity. I think Tagore must have followed him. And that is Tolstoy, an aristocrat. As was to a certain extent, because there are different categories there. The son of a landowner who was Tagore. And that was Tolstoy. The cooperatives, the kind of work he did with peasants. He gave most of his wealth, Count Leo Tolstoy, for the creation of, and you know, cooperatives, there always is an educational element about them. So you cannot separate cooperatives from education. So you're going to run your own land, you're going to run your own process, and on the process, you have to learn the skills to do that. Okay, so yeah. And then from the East, we haven't mentioned. The East, now I'm talking about what we used to call the Soviet bloc.
Yeah.
Makharenko would be a classic example there. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there are great critical educators everywhere, everywhere.
That's a huge array of critical educators, and
But
I'm
that's how it
sure.
should be. But that's how it should be.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, critical education is not the prerogative, the preserve of one part of the world. Just because you have access to publications, which is North America, or England, which is basically the Anglophone area, although many people are not Anglophones themselves. I mean, Donaldo Macedo, who publishes with Paulo Freire, like Freire, comes from the majority, the geographical majority is from Capo Verde. Capo Verde is an African.
Yeah.
Anyway, Portuguese implanted Africa, you know, the Portuguese sector of it, like João Parasqueva, for instance, in Mozambique. So, of course, there are great educators. Another great figure, intellectual, who invested a lot in education, was killed by the Portuguese secret police, is Amilcar Cabral. Paulo Freire did a lot of work about him. And he considered himself to be the leading African organic intellectual.
When I think of Africa and Brazil, and you talk about the East, many countries,
and you mentioned Asia, and we have
Asia. Well, then I think of countries who need critical pedagogy to liberate themselves from colonial countries, to liberate themselves from power.
Who said they are not liberated in their minds? However, circumstances have suppressed them.
What I want
liberated mentally.
I'm just what I was aiming at. Do we need critical education in the Netherlands? Do we need critical education in Malta?
The Netherlands. I mean, you can talk about this more than I do. You know the context, not I. I mean, the people I know about from the Netherlands are great philosophers. Desiderius Erasmus, okay, very much taken up by the European Union, but for superficial reasons, of course. And who's the other one? Baruch Spinoza, and people like that. Of course, you have many, but I expect you to talk about that, not me, because you know the country more than I do. Of course, we need that. Listen, as Anna Arendt said, it's not just dangerous ideas. Thinking, especially free thinking, is itself dangerous. Okay, I mean, of course. And for me, the educator could be, that's why I like my work in adult education, because you can do anything. Because anything connects with education, it's about consciousness.
Yeah.
So in Shakespeare, I see elements for an education in Shakespeare. Not everything, of course, not everything, you know, I mean, he's propagandistic in an aspect, you know, I mean, but there are many, many insights that one gets from a great writer.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Some were also educators, and lousy ones, apparently, in terms of discipline, like Oliver Goldsmith. But, you know, you have a lot going on. So who's the educator is my big question. And should we professionalize something which is not professional? It does include professionals, but also some great stuff from non-professionals. I mean, Gramsci didn't see himself as an educator, but he was.
Yeah.
He was. He saw himself as a politician and a political thinker. But even that is education. Never mind his actual work with workers, or even organizing with others a prison school while he was awaiting his sentence on the island of Ustica. So that makes him much more relevant to education, or creating the factory council movement, not creating, sorry, but theorizing the factory council movement like the cooperatives. It had an educational element to it. It was an educative agency, as a cooperative would be. This is more than just a cooperative. Yugoslavia used to have a lot of education for self-management. Not very popular. People push the capitalist agenda, make fun of it. They make fun of this, but that was the old Yugoslavia. It does not exist anymore under Tito. You know, they introduced self-management, and it had an effect even in my country, this, amongst workers' participation there. You know, I mean, they wrote papers about education for self-management. because any kind of participation has an educational element.
Yeah.
For
Yeah,
Gramsci, everything was education, because for Gramsci, education was central and not schooling, to hegemony.
I think that's the
Of education.
first step to realize that education does not just happen within the walls of your school building.
Sure,
It's
sure,
a very small and limited amount.
sure, sure. And you remember Gramsci, every relationship of hegemony, that's how hegemony works. I'm using the English way of translating, which is closer to the Greek original, hegemonia, okay, is an educational relationship.
Yeah.
It is, even the state is, in the state is also telling you, is educating you, as somebody once wrote.
Yeah.
The state states and never stop, like me, never stop stalking.
Well, that's true. That's true. I just want to finish by saying that during the crisis, many schools were closed, and the government keeps saying that there are so many learning gaps, implicating that learning just happens within the school building. Hence, the huge learning gaps within students. And that's ridiculous because learning.
It writes off all the popular education, the indigenous education with the elders, you know. UNESCO did recognize that, because when they spoke about in the 70s education for all, they didn't call it education for all then, later they did, but they did, and realized that many countries, impoverished countries, because they were coming out of the colonial situation, and some of them never had schools for everybody, only for a tiny elite, to civilize them into the colonial way, civilizing mission, okay? Assimilados, they used to call them in the former Portuguese colonies in Africa, assimilados. The first thing that a new country had was to create spaces for education. And of course, UNESCO and these countries realized they didn't have the wherewithal, the money to create schools. So it started recognizing, valorizing indigenous and non-formal education. And that was given a great boost by UNESCO. Of course, UNESCO didn't have the money like the European Union has to back projects with money and attract people, and probably the wrong people because of the money. You know, people who saw education as business to get money, not to do proper education.
We talked about your work as a professor. We talked about critical pedagogy, critical education. We talked about ChatGPT. We talked
about culture and music.
We talked about music.
All kinds of culture.
We talked about literature, the big names in literature. So we covered a huge area. I really enjoyed it. Peter, go to bed, get some sleep.
And make sure you have focus recorded.
Sylvia, it's going to be.
It's my sister-in-law, Sylvia. That's her name.
Peter, thanks for your time. You were really generous. Enjoy the rest of the night. I hope you get some sleep. And
I rattle off. Sorry for meandering. Good night.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
And thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.